What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of a People Nerds webinar workshop. This is the third in our three-part series, The New Fundamentals of User Research. Let's keep dropping where you're dialing in from, and I'm going to turn things over to an esteemed colleague of mine, someone who I had the pleasure of getting to know, interestingly, remotely. Kelly works in our innovation design lab called The Studio. She'll talk a little bit more about what that work is, but she has great expertise and experience in managing broadly defined research projects while we're remote. So Kelly, thank you so much for joining us. Take it away, please.
Thanks so much, Ben. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to speak with you all today. So we'll be spending about the next hour or so talking about some themes, some best practices, and some approaches that I've noticed during the past 7 months of remote work, as compared with some of my previous experience of remote project management. To get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I am currently a lead for DScout's Studio. Studio is DScout's full service innovation consultancy, as Ben mentioned. We work on a lot of generative and foundational types of projects ranging across a number of industries from tech, consumer products, financial services. We do work that's very similar to like user experience, innovation, strategy, that kind of thing. And the kind of questions we answer tend to be things like, how might this product or service fit into somebody's life? What kind of moments does this product best support? How are people reacting to and interacting with advertisements or other like moment-based kind of things? We also have a lot of like interviewing capacity now, which is pretty awesome. Previously to starting at DScout, I've been working in the realm of design research and user research since about 2013 after getting my master's in social sciences from the University of Chicago. But that is enough about me. Let's move on to some of this interesting stuff now. I actually am going to talk a little bit more about myself and my personal experience during this time. I started my current role at the studio in March of 2020. And to be more specific, it was March 23rd of 2020, which was the very first Monday that the company went remote. So at the time, this seemed kind of like a small inconvenience. I'd be like 2 weeks until I got to meet all of my new teammates in person and be back in project rooms and have a bunch of whiteboards and all of the like benefits of an office space. But 7 months later, this is actually my very first day in the DScout office as an employee. That being said, I don't think my experience was too tremendously different from the norm overall. But I do think that it highlighted some areas that I wouldn't have been as quick to see had I not entered this space the way I did. Let's talk a little bit about research and design research in general on the next slide. So we have here an idea that a lot of this work has always had a remote component to it. Client management almost always meant collaborating with a team in a different office, a different state, or even a different country. At my previous role, we had offices in several countries, even in different continents. And these cross-office projects were often substantially different in terms of management approach than a project based solely out of our Chicago office. A majority of the communication was done via email or video conference, and there was always a mix of the synchronous or asynchronous communication and collaboration. So balancing time zones and even different working hours was just part of the job, but it was more of the exception and not the rule. If we wanted to have like a working analysis session, for instance, we could usually make that happen in person rather than having to rely on a virtual environment. And I bring this up because you'd think that we'd be kind of prepared from that front for some of the like challenges that this specific instance has brought to us. But I still think that there is a lot of room to grow here. On the next slide, I specifically call out like, at the end of the day, the people that I worked most closely with were usually just a few feet away from me. At this point, thinking about project rooms that we would like cram 5 people into, it's really mind blowing at this point. I could pop over to somebody's desk to chat. We could whiteboard together. I could point at somebody's screen and get the point across. It's all a lot of stuff that I really took for granted at the time. And a lot of this was something I took for granted. Oh my gosh, the lights. Relationship building through collaboration and social moments were really seamlessly built into the day. So it didn't really take much effort at all to have these kinds of interactions. And at this point, that sort of organic input from a wider team, it's really missing in a lot of how we are building out our typical work days. On the next slide, I have a quote from a former coworker and current friend of mine, Ashley Spencer, who used to have a fully remote position with HPE. During the course of this, we spoke a lot about the challenges of switching to a remote role unexpectedly versus working full-time for a company in a pre-planned remote format. So one of the points that she brought up is that it takes more than just being on a team to get the benefits of being on a team. And it takes more than just being remote to get the benefits of working remotely. There's a huge need for process and intentionality in the approach here. Reflecting on this, like one of the major differences that we ended up discussing was, besides like the equipment and the ergonomics and the planning that goes into like having a remote role from the get-go, was the intentionality of supporting remote team building and celebrating the traits and behaviors that really support this kind of work. In this case, think of things like autonomy and independence that are granted these employees who are hired to be full-time remote from the get-go. Before we start talking about the challenges and solutions in this space, I'd also like to take a moment to reflect on some of the positive changes and benefits that we've noticed, and some of the things that we'd maybe like to hold on to as we establish new habits and practices. At this point, I'd really love to hear from you all. What are some of the benefits that you've discovered for yourselves? While you're typing that out and thinking through that, I'll share what mine have been. So for me, I really love having the freedom to define my own schedule in a new way. I can start my workday a little bit earlier, but I actually don't have to lose out on any sleep. I don't have to wake up any earlier. I've really never been a morning person, and I haven't found a way to convert yet. I've also been able to really rethink my daily routines. I've gotten so much better at making sure that I actually eat lunch regularly. It's not something that I just keep putting off. I'm taking midday pauses to do something that makes me happy, maybe walking my dogs. And that also feeds into the idea of having more flexibility with my time at home. I can manage my appointments. I can spend more time with my partner. I feel a lot more connected to my home life than I did previously when I was traveling for consulting purposes all the time. So Ben, what do we have in the chat? What are some of the benefits we have coming up?
A lot of good ones related to what I'll call work-life balance, broadly defined. Runs, as you said, times when you can wake up. Randy makes their eggs exactly how they want them. Love it. Crystal talking about saving time on the commute as someone who lives kind of far away from Chicago but commutes in. That's a big one for me. It feels like a lot of folks are saying that they're able to conserve more of their cognitive and physical energy so that they can devote it when, as one of our attendees said, inspiration strikes. They're able to, it was Angela, leverage it most.
Awesome. That's so great. One thing I do want to consider about these benefits is that sometimes they can even wind up as their own challenges if we're not careful. Without really taking the time to build trust in your team, sometimes having this balance and this flexibility can lead to having these feelings of guilt or even shame. So I'd like to talk a little bit next about some of the challenges that we're facing here, and then move on to some of the solutions. So on the next slide, we have a little bit about the challenges that I've specifically noticed. I think it's important to, first off, not underestimate the burden of change in the situation. It can be so easy to dismiss some of these things as negligible or unimportant, but they all really add up to have a serious impact on our energy, productivity, and resilience. So some of the things that were difficult for me at first, they were hard to name. They were hard to put like an actual like nomenclature to. At the 6-month mark of being remote, the studio came together to kind of reflect on what was going well, what could be going better, and what were some of the things that the office did for us that we were really missing. From that conversation, I've identified these 5 areas as the major challenges that I was hearing and feeling myself. The first of these is a lack of serendipity. Think about this as you no longer have those casual collisions with coworkers during the day to like organically connect and share ideas. Those little moments do a lot for both the work and for team dynamic and connection. Like seeing the whiteboards in the project rooms allowed for some moments of sharing and collaboration that weren't necessarily planned, but got kind of like the best thoughts from everybody on the team. And it really, really brought a lot of the work we were doing to life. The next is this thing that I'm calling interaction overhead. Let's think about this one as it takes time to plan out every interaction you have with intentionality over the course of the day. This ranges from like having to draft messages in Slack or Teams to writing up thoughtful comments that are as clear as possible so that there's no miscommunication or hurt feelings or lack of clarity, and learning to do like this need to learn new ways to do old activities. All of those minutes really start to add up, and all of that effort can really start vying for your focus and energy. Third, I mean, this one's pretty obvious, but like missing out on social cues. Like on the obvious side, this can mean body language, facial expression, overall tone in a room. But it could also mean things like, oh, it's time to get lunch, or oh, it's time to go home. Just seeing what people around you are doing. And it can also really help to establish the acceptable behaviors that we were talking about from the benefits section of this presentation. Seeing your manager set an example of leaving early when they need to pick up their kid, or take a midday break to like work out. It really sets a tone for acceptability of those practices. And right now, we're not seeing that in our teammates all the time. I really appreciate it when my team will set their Slack away messages to things like making lunch or going for a run. It really communicates that sense of this isn't just you, we're all in this together. Without transparency in these behaviors, we can really start to feel unsure of our own actions. And without these feelings of permission, taking those breaks and taking more ownership of your own schedule can be triggers for shame, which at the end of the day is going to erode trust and lead to burnout. This one also felt a little bit obvious and silly to me when I first started thinking about it. But this one is like using the office itself as its own mnemonic device. I think about this as the office space actually signaling to you to remember the small work tasks that seem natural during the day while you're there. But now, instead of being signaled to work on that side project with the committee that you were talking about back in February, you're now being signaled to do the dishes or fold the laundry or like walk the dog or something along those lines. So there's like little things that you just aren't supporting you along the way. Finally, there aren't any more liminal moments in your day. You don't have those small moments between meetings to reset. You don't have your commute to get into that work mindset. And even just like changes in your environment to refresh your thinking as you switch from your desk to your conference room to a phone booth. All of those moments are just kind of mushed together. I know that many days I'm just sitting in the same spot from like 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. without really moving around very much, just one meeting to the other, back to back. So I'd like to pause here for a moment one more time. I'm wondering if any of these really resonate with you at all. Is there anything you'd like to add from your own experience, or does anybody want to share a story or example of some of the challenges that they're facing?
Kelly, I love that you included missing social cues. My other role is as an adjunct faculty member at DePaul University. And this quarter I'm teaching, so Tiziana teaching remote classes. I'm teaching a nonverbal communication course to graduate students. And it has been a masterclass in, thinking about social distance, thinking about our facial expressions, and we are covering them for right safety, who gets to go into certain spaces and not. That certainly extends over to our working space. And for many of the folks who are here, I'm assuming that so much of your work is mixed methods, working with open-ended, often grounded theoretical data. You're trying to get in, and as Kelly will talk about later, it's, we were actually joking about how the the Post-it note kind of loses some of its sharpness when it's just yours that are up on the board. Folks are talking about talking into a void. Yes, absolutely. You're simply talking to your screen. So I think a lot of what you're saying, Kelly, resonates with folks here, especially because of the kinds of questions and the orientations that they take toward those questions. Very collaborative, iterative. The things that make anthropologists, sociologists, and broadly human-centered thinkers so in demand right now.
Awesome. Yeah. The next piece that I'd really like to talk about here are some of the more actionable pieces, the solutions and fixes that I've been trying to implement for myself and my own team as we've been moving forward. In the past few weeks, I've really been looking at processes and behaviors that are making the projects feel easier as opposed to harder. Like these solutions obviously aren't going to be a home run for everyone, and different methods within each of these solutions will work for different people at different teams. But I think at the core, focusing on these 3 areas is a really great start to finding your footing on smooth remote project work. For the next section, I'll be talking about communicating boundaries and work styles, practicing adaptiveness and flexibility, and exploring a variety of collaboration models. So for communicating boundaries and teamwork habits, we just talked about how we're missing a lot of our normal everyday cues. Part of supporting this lack of context is to be much more explicit with our communication. I've learned that it might be annoying, but it's way more helpful to err on the side of over communication than under communication when trying to navigate something. It's also really important to have clear and open lines of communication. We've had time to adjust to our home offices and Zoom calls, but there's still some dynamic components to everyone's day. At the beginning of each project, it's important to set the team up for success by really meeting people where they're at. So I recommend sitting down as a team to talk about what everyone's workday and work week looks like. Does somebody have a hard stop at 4:30 for childcare? What is the team's natural proclivity for mornings or afternoons? This is really not a normal time, and accounting for that abnormality in planning and execution is really dependent upon these clear lines of communication. So I've encouraged people to really reflect on what their boundaries are, what their signs of stress are, and to really build self-awareness around these pieces. What we have on the screen right now is an activity that I use when I'm working with a larger team or a client team to get a sense of the best way to align and to give everyone a chance to set boundaries, acknowledge those boundaries of others. It also really helps to start building towards an open, trusting team dynamic. Knowing what's happening with the other members of your team is really a great step to establishing that trust with one another and avoiding those feelings of shame and guilt. With smaller teams, I will tend to just kind of take pieces of this and have an intentional conversation as opposed to like bringing out a worksheet and some pencils or whatever. But as we're planning the course of the project, it's a little bit easier, you might think, to sort of navigate day to day, week to week with 1 or 2 other people than with a team of like 5+.
Hey, Kelly.
Yep.
Question from some folks. How does that look in practice? Is this something that each individual teammate creates? Mm-hmm. Do you have a single doc that folks complete in, say, different colors to denote or connote who is who?
Yeah. So typically what I will do is have a sheet for everybody or a Google Doc or whatever the format is for everybody on the team to kind of sit through, think and fill out. Specifically writing things down, like what do you imagine your role on the project to be? Do you see this as like, what are your daily tasks going to be? What would you like them to be? Setting an intention for the project around the areas that they want to grow in, the goals that they want to achieve over the course of this, what they want to learn, what they want to improve on, as well as noting things like, this is the time I'll be on PTO. I will be having like a committee meeting that's really important this week of the project, so I might be a little distracted then. And now I've also been trying to include the idea of like remote needs in this section as well. Like I know now that like every day at 3:30, one of my dogs is going to start crying and be very disruptive until I take him out because he's learned that he can do that now. It's really a shame. But things like also in that bucket might be I on Tuesdays, I need to get a later start because I have to take care of childcare from like 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. And just having that on the table, no judgment, this is something we can work with. Another thing that's been really helpful is just sketching out what your daily schedule is. When do you start work? When do you end work? Do you prefer to like take a little time off in the afternoons to get things finished, heads down in the evening? Do you have specific breaks in the day that you want to set aside for like lunch, for coffee, for just like clearing your head? Do you do your best thinking early in the morning? Do you have a better time focusing in the afternoon? When is the best time to actually have these different types of meetings? And then finally, this one is a little bit sensitive and it might work for some people, it might not work for others, but thinking about attributes of yourself at your best and at your worst. These could be like physical characteristics. These could be like tendencies or even things like tics that start to come out. But thinking about the kinds of things that will happen when you're under a lot of stress, it's really easy to ignore these signs of burnout or fatigue as they're happening. So taking a moment to reflect on what you could be looking out for to kind of avoid letting these things boil over. And this is something that you don't necessarily have to share any more than you're comfortable with your team. But depending on the level of trust and connection you feel there, it could be something you could be like, hey, if you start noticing that I'm getting defensive when I'm talking about your edits to my comments, it's probably because I'm stressed out and I'm aware of this and I would like to like work on it. Or even much less like direct examples of that. This document in particular will be shared out at the end. Please feel free to adapt it in whatever way you'd like to. I've seen it done where people will like actually draw out their best and worst selves, adapt it to whatever you need to do, but it's been massively helpful in especially large teams, bringing them together. All right, moving on to the next part. This is practicing being adaptive and flexible. I'd like to use like setting up a meeting cadence for a project as an example here. At some points of a project, it varies day to day. How often does it make sense to meet as a group, as a sub-team? Does the team need daily check-ins, twice a day check-ins, once a week check-ins? What is going to actually propel the project forward at the best pace? And it's at the end of the day, it's really important to set up these cadences to play to the people's strengths on the team. Are you going to get the most out of email, chat, video calls, or even just an old school phone call? Don't limit yourself to a medium that is going to stifle your clear expression of ideas. Determine what the best medium will be for a check-in and daily communication. It's really helpful for me to like kind of share out the preferred platforms and come to a consensus as a team so everyone's kind of on the same page. For example, at the start of projects that I lead, I tend to say that email is almost exclusively reserved for me for like client communications and calendar invites and like notifications for documents that have comments on them. I much prefer to rely on chat for day-to-day team communications, and I answer those very quickly. And I prefer like a phone call for like very, very time critical pieces of information. It's also pretty important to acknowledge that different parts of a project are going to require different levels of collaboration. While having a plan is important, like acknowledging that it's okay for a plan to change based on shifting contexts is also pretty critical. What we have on the screen here is an example of the calendar format that my teams like to use. This is pretty flexible. It's a spreadsheet format. It's based a lot around identifying key areas to consider while determining cadence. For example, during field work, it might be pretty critical to check in multiple times per day to make sure that things are moving forward appropriately. During recruiting, it might be easier to meet less frequently while we're going through the recruiting process where there's less time critical touch points. And then obviously, like, this isn't set in stone. It's easy to add and subtract different points of this. I find it very helpful to have notes in the week 1, week 2, week 3 kind of column that come and go as the needs of the project shift that week. I also, as I'm thinking about the different phases of a project, find it helpful to consider these sort of 3 spectrum that I have up here, and this little pick list of preferred contact methods. Here, like, let's talk about the spectrum a little bit. People can vary in their preferred types of communication pretty widely. And this happens like at the individual level, and this happens at like the, I'd say, meeting level as well. When considering a meeting, these 3 scales really help me center my thinking, adapt to the team's needs. These are also like across a spectrum too. It's not an all or nothing in situation. How much information like you need might vary on your role and what the meeting is about. So in some cases, I might need to be told literally everything about what's happening. Give me every piece of detail, give me all of the background. Let's get really, really in depth in this. Whereas other meetings, I might just need the basics. Like, this isn't something that I need to be the expert in. It's also helpful to think about, is this something where we're all going to have to work together to accomplish this? Is it going to be a quick share out and then we jump out to our different tasks? Or is this going to be something where we're all going to be in it together for the entirety of the hour? Linked to that, like, should this be like a scheduled meeting or a series of meetings? Or should this be kind of a check-in as needed sort of cadence? Yeah, like, just touching on, is it a collaborative session or will most of the work be heads down?
Hey, Kelly?
Yes.
Who tends to own this calendar? Is, for example, this something that you would share with a stakeholder? Is this just living on your personal calendar? Is this on a team-based calendar? What does this look like or can look like in practice?
In practice, I typically have 2 versions of the calendar. One is sort of a set in stone calendar that we share externally with the client that has the big key dates marked out. It's a little bit more high level than the internal team calendar would be. I usually have the project lead own the calendar as well, so that there's one single point of contact who's keeping track of everything. For the internal team calendar, things might shift around a little bit more. It might be somewhere where you could call out, okay, Kelly will be owning this portion of the document, whereas Ben will be owning this other portion of the document, et cetera, et cetera. And it's easier to have those kinds of shifting moments of like, okay, well, we have 10 days to recruit. It looks like we're going to have a delay here because we don't have the finalized screener in hand yet. However, we should be able to reach this number within X number of days. So if we adjust this and adjust this, we'll still hit our timeline. That kind of flexibility, I think, comes up a lot in projects.
Certainly. And I'm just struck by how smart it is and how shrewd it is to ask folks both their preferences for meeting types and kinds. Again, I'm thinking about learning styles. Some students or folks are quite good with written sort of evaluations. Others are good with verbal. Still others are good with more creative, collaborative. Similarly here, I think for you, knowing both your own collaborators and your stakeholders, what their preferred I guess, collaboration style, communicator style, I think that really helps you get on the right foot from the beginning when, as you said, things inevitably change. Both Chris and Rod are talking about how things change. And I think knowing up front both the preferences of your own collaborators and team and the preferences of your stakeholders. Like, I'm sure you've had some clients, Kelly, who expect or want a readout at this end of every day. Even if nothing really, quote unquote, new happened, they would really love to hear from you each day. And still others just want you to put a calendar hold for the deliverable and share out date, and they'll be there, right? So kicking off, especially when you don't have proximity to folks, when you are mediated in this way, I got to imagine that's key.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And like, depending on who your client stakeholder is, if they are an on the ground researcher, there might be a ton more collaboration than if there's somebody who's a little more removed from the project itself. And I found actually in those situations where I'm collaborating very closely with the client, we might just have a single calendar that reflects all of these changes more transparently because they care about those things. The clients who don't care about it, I try to keep it as simple and like unconfusing as possible.
Sure. Yeah. That single source of truth, and whether or not they check in with it all the time. That makes a ton of sense.
Awesome. Yeah, the next point I'd like to talk about is exploring different collaboration models. And for this part, I'd like to think a little bit about the analysis and synthesis process. This has been personally the biggest challenge, finding the right kind of collaboration models, like the lack of hands-on deck sketching, the lack of real live movable Post-it notes, the simple act of pointing at a screen, like I mentioned before, like these are things I so took for granted. Finding ways to do this effectively and efficiently while being remote has been a huge challenge, especially when I'm so used to working so closely with my team. There are like a ton of projects and services and tools available to help with this process. Personally, I throw Miro at a lot of my problems. I've heard a lot of people using Mural as well. I've been a big fan of the Jamboards that they just added to Google Hangouts. I know Trello has been helpful for a lot of people. Like, who else has some favorite tools and approaches that they've used? Like, please, like, feel free to share in the chat. It'd be great to have a sense of like what all is out there and what all is working well for different people. I'd also like to talk a little bit about what has worked really well for me when hosting a remote synchronous analysis session. There are several considerations that you have to make here. For instance, like, what will users be interacting with? Is the tool actually accessible? How intuitive is the tool? How familiar will the other users be? Does this mean that the moderator will be driving, or will each user have some autonomy in contributing? Secondly, it's really important to plan through how ideas will be captured and shared. Is it going to be more Post-it note based? Is it going to be a notes document kind of thing with a designated note taker? And how can we make it accessible for people to see these ideas visualized in the moment? Thirdly, what will communication look like? Will it take place via chat, sort of like we're doing here? Is it going to be breakout groups like Zoom can do sometimes, or you'll have just a small group of 2 or 3 people chatting about a topic? Or is the group small enough that a regular video call will do, and there isn't really any further structure that will be necessary for that? And finally, while it is so important to have structure to these meetings, it's also so important to leave room for any serendipity that we can account for there. Just like in an in-person session, even though it's impossible to replicate an analysis session, one-to-one reality to virtual, there are certain touch points that are really helpful for letting ideas kind of take shape and get built out. Maybe have like an additional 10 or 15 minutes set aside that could either be like next step planning or really digging into an idea or question that people are sort of jamming on or really excited about and digging into. Finally, like, beyond just finding a tool that works for you, the other part of the process is being like very intentional about how these sessions are set up. Is it going to be synchronous? Is it going to be asynchronous? And when is it important to switch from one to the other? So this is, again, something that varies from team to team, project to project. This is loosely what has been working for me when I've been thinking about assigning and completing tasks during analysis in particular. Comments. Comments on docs has been a great way to determine if you need to sync up or split out. Are you seeing a lot of high-level conceptual comments in your Google Doc? And is it very challenging to incorporate them? Does it seem like they're coming in at a level that is kind of above what the document is at? That is an excellent sign that it is time to talk through these kinds of things rather than review separately. The same goes for video meetings. If you're hearing a lot of tactical, wordsmithing, highly detailed comments, those things might be better cataloged like directly in a doc asynchronously. I also find that it's much easier to piece the story of a project together, bringing everybody's perspectives and memories to the table to start figuring out what the most interesting and actionable story might be, while looking for the data might be something that is better spent heads down. One of my favorite activities to do in this story finding mode is to have everybody just take 5 minutes to like write down a paragraph of what they think the story so far is. Don't try to make it sound like too detailed. Just go with your gut, write it all down, and see what is coming out of that. I think it's a really great way to get people who might not be super comfortable sharing verbally to have the space that they need to be thoughtful and intentional in this process as well. I guess this really goes hand in hand with the idea of using synchronicity, I guess, to align and using asynchronous approaches to perform specialized tasks. So building out the deck, doing some deck sketching, maybe we're coming together for that, but when we're actually like pulling the data from crosstabs or pulling the data from the platform, maybe that's something we do asynchronously.
Kelly, well, there was a really good question from, let's see here, Rod asked if we have any suggestions or if folks in the audience do on co-creation sessions. I know that's a little more tactical here, but Rod, I know we use the DScout platform, for example, to do just what we're doing here. We hold a moderated session and we'll have participants draw and hold up what they're drawing and give us a tour. And this can work asynchronously too, wherein we'll use a mobile moments study where we'll ask them to draw again a thing and then walk us through what's going on, whether that's a journey or a process or even something like how they get up in the morning and the things they typically do. I think sometimes it's more comfortable for a person to co-create when, say, Kelly or I aren't just like sitting right next to them looking at what they're creating. It can be especially helpful if you give them some lead time. So you schedule a session for a Thursday, you give them a sort of homework assignment to think through Monday through Wednesday, and they come ready, so to speak, or at least with elevated or topper of mind, if it will, more top of mind questions and thoughts. But Kelly, what suggestions or thoughts do you have on this maybe relationship between you and the research participant versus working synchronously or asynchronously?
Yeah, personally, we've had a couple of diary projects where we've asked people to sketch out either like their journey in learning something or share ideas for features or products that would be influential in that moment. And again, sometimes this will come in the form of asking them to submit a picture of something they've created themselves. Sometimes it'll come from submitting stimuli that they can react to. Every once in a while, we've considered using even just like providing a template as stimuli in the platform for them to use to sort of fill out in a way that's going to be more comparable across participants. For live interviews, we've had a lot of luck actually using Miro as a interactive platform. Typically, this means that we, the moderator, will be driving just because we can't assume that all participants will be familiar with the tool, try to avoid that kind of like problems with either like Chrome extensions, et cetera.
Oh, sure.
But we've had a really, really good experience using that for things like card sorting or journey mapping, and even like building out ideas and responses to different concepts.
Yeah, I've seen information architecture studies, again, same sort of aligns with card sorting, happen in Trello, happen in Excel. I'm looking at the chat. Lots of folks are retrofitting their office suites, whatever they happen to be using, especially when there's a cell or a column that can be adjusted. That's great. So yeah, if y'all have any other tools that you're using or approaches, toss that in the chat. This is great.
Awesome. It's great to hear. All right. So finally, this brings me to like, what do we do next? It's become pretty obvious that remote work is going to be a part of our lives for the foreseeable future. It's been a big pivot from 2 weeks to 7 months and beyond. At this point, I think it's been time to kind of check back in if you haven't already, because what was working in March might not be working anymore now. Having an intentional conversation with your team can make all of the difference here. Like, we've all discovered that we can't just expect to replace things in a one-to-one format. A Zoom call won't work for every kind of meeting. And on that note, like, even having a conversation around what is the preferred video etiquette? What have we learned as a group? Is it important to have cameras on? Is it important to have cameras off? Is it important to come in mic muted? Are you used to coming in like with an auto mute and then it's off and then you start muttering to yourself while you're doing something else during a presentation? Because that definitely has not happened to me. But there's a lot of different things to consider here. Secondly, this has been something that I've noticed in myself a lot. It's so exhausting to constantly be in presenter mode. A lot of our like Zoom meetings, like Google Meets, Blue Jeans, whatever kind of video calls, either subtly or not so subtly, put us on the spot in a manner, even when we're just playing a passive mode here. The solution isn't to just never turn on your video either, because that has its own problems. We already talked about like talking to the void, especially for professors. But it is time to find ways to disconnect. I've had some really good audio only, like office hours style work sessions with my team that have been great for that. I've also fallen into a really comfortable communication sequence with my teammates on Slack, kind of finding your own voice and being able to sort of learn the communication habits of your close teammates. What reads as sarcasm is a great one to kind of figure out. The next one is a really, really big one. I have actually 2 links embedded in this one, and that is why it's underlined in addition to it being so important. And this is about demonstrating trust. If you just Google trust and remote work right now, you're going to get slammed with information. It's a huge topic, and it's a problem that we've known about long before the current circumstance, but is also one that is coming to a head right now. Demonstrating trust can also be an enormously scary step to take on a team where it's lacking. One of the articles that I've linked is a Harvard Business Review article from July of this year that's simply entitled, Remote Managers Are Having Trust Issues. This really calls out that remote work can be even more productive than working in an office, but only if it's designed well. And this really depends on having faith in your employees. Managers need to be educated about what the potential benefits of remote working are and demonstrate that trust. If autonomy is low and micromanagement is high because of managerial mistrust, the benefits of remote work are not going to come through. And managers need to understand like the work designs that need to be put into place in order to better facilitate this effective remote working style. The other article has some of the is from Holloway and has a number of suggestions on day-to-day activities, what to look for, how to manage expectations to sort of start building those feelings of trust. I would recommend reading both of them, even if you aren't a manager. They're incredibly helpful, and I think it's a topic that we really need to delve into with like an open mind and a desire to really push that forward as we are working remotely. Finally, we need to really provide opportunities to share and celebrate work. This is something that I really miss in the office, just knowing what is happening with my other teammates, like where are we in a project, what has come out of that work, I guess maybe I'm just nosy, but I'm really curious. Like, what are my teammates doing? How is it going? Like, what kind of cool stuff have they found? I also want to share the cool stuff that I've found. But like these kind of rituals or even like casual collisions are something that really form organically over time for teams. And we don't always create the space for them in remote teams. And whether that's because of video call fatigue, stress, awkwardness, or just like lack of time, being intentional and creating rituals will help your team feel united, even if it's something as simple as like building in time to share what everyone is doing for the week, or having that kind of office hours set up for teammates to bounce ideas off of their coworkers that they don't casually see anymore. Are there any rituals out there that people miss? Anything that they've started since they've been remote?
Kelly, I can say that even though it's quite satisfying to like click on a checklist item and see the, the UI, strike it through, that's it. Then there's likely more work to do. That resonates with me so much that the work ostensibly never can end. And when it's in this 2D, it's much different when you're in a room and you can read the body language of others to see like, yes, we did it. I think taking that time to be more explicit with it, GIFs or GIFs, depending on your particular camp, D-Scout and People Nerds use those liberally. And we try to pick the wackiest ones. That's certainly something that we have been doing. Have you noticed, Kelly, anything changing in the ways that your clients are thinking about the projects, either in terms of scope, timing expectations? We talked a bit about the extent to which they'd want to be involved. Are you noticing anything in, again, granted, a small sample size of since March, but what are you noticing?
One of the things that I guess I've seen since March is we've been invited to be like in like internal chat groups a lot more frequently. Like that is becoming a much more primary mode of communication than email as it was previously. And I can't really say with certainty if that is a effect of remote working or if that is an effect of like just the client groups that I'm working with. But I've seen kind of a shift there in terms of how we're communicating and how we're collaborating on like a daily basis. In terms of how projects are being scoped, it seems like it's been pretty similar in my experience. I would say that we are getting maybe a little bit more flexibility in terms of how field work is being scheduled. We're seeing the ability to schedule our our in-depth interviews a little bit more flexibly throughout the day, as opposed to really having to like focus on those after hours kind of time slots.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the disruption for all humans has the benefit, if I can be so bold, that the research that we need to and want to conduct on those humans is itself disrupted, and so the old structure doesn't fit because that's not how most folks are living these days, for example, as to when an interview might be needed or when someone might complete a study or want to, for example.
Mm-hmm. One last thing I'd like to say on this front is that right now I think we're spending so much of our energy on interaction overhead, and we're really missing out on areas where we really benefit from being more intentional and setting up this time, as opposed to trying to figure out how to like manage some small meetings throughout the day. Maybe it would be more beneficial for a team to spend that time thinking about these group rituals, like the project share outs that I've heard people in the chat mention. I love that Discord is coming up here too. I think that would be a really interesting tool for these kinds of like day-to-day sort of rituals.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly. This has been great. I know it was quite the Herculean task to take the small sample size times your new and exciting role and make some recommendations for folks I'll turn to the chat to see if there's anything outstanding that folks have. As a reminder, you will get the slides, this recording, and any resources that Kelly had. Let me give folks a few seconds here, or a minute or two, to see if there's anything that pops up that they want to know more about. I guess here's a question, Kelly, that I had kind of going into this. What if you're on a very small team? Let's say you're a team of one, and your projects are maybe fewer, or they're fewer and more important. Do you have any suggestions for those who might be on a smaller team or a team of one?
Yeah, that I feel is like a very hard place to be right now, in terms of feeling isolated from different ideas and collaboration. Because even just having like one other person to bounce ideas off of work through thoughts with, I would suggest trying to find a stakeholder in your organization who has time for even like a coffee chat to sort of go through that process with. There are so many free tools out there that I think will help sort of guide your ideas and organization, and just being careful not to get too pulled into your like own like isolated world there. We have, when I was more solo on teams, I've found a lot of like solace in like the Mixed Methods Slack channel and the People Nerd Slack channel. There's such a big community out there to learn from and grow with that I feel like that has been an incredible resource for me personally.
Yeah. Plus one to Mixed Methods and the work that Ariel is doing. We've had the pleasure of working with her and that Mixed Methods team. If the UX conferences that are moving to digital are really a great place to. Some of them are often discounted or free. Those are really great places to spur engagement. And speaking of the People Nerd Slack channel, if something comes up between now and say tonight, and you want maybe to pick Kelly or if you're crazy enough, my brain, we will be in the New Fundamentals Slack channel, which is in the People Nerds Slack channel. We'll plan a time for that next week. So if you have lingering questions or something bubbled up, we'll make sure to include how you can join the People Nerds Slack channel in our follow-up. There's a virtual lunch for UXers every Friday at 1 p.m. Yael, where could you drop the link for that in the chat? If you don't mind. Yeah, again, there's a lot of great resources for folks out there. But thank you so much, both Kelly and everyone who joined us today. Do stay tuned to your inboxes. You'll be getting the recording, the slides, and all sorts of great stuff. And tune in. We'll be having a workshop on moderated research. We talked a little bit about it with co-creation sessions and journeys and walkthroughs. We'll be talking with someone else from the studio team, as well as some folks who work with moderated research tools to better understand and leverage that method when it's maybe not the safest time for you to visit folks in home. So stay tuned for that. Here is the UX support group meetup link. Thank you, Yael, for that link. And Kelly, thank you again. It was absolutely wonderful to spend some time.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for your time today.
All right, be well, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll talk soon. Take care.